They pushed on to the airstrip, the fourth and last field on the island, and with its capture, after scattered resistance by Japanese armed mostly with mortars, they controlled 85% of the island. The Japanese that remained had been pushed down to the southern end, toward Lalo and Mapi points. General Schmidt's orders were now succinct: annihilate the opposing Japanese. Prisoners indicated that the Japanese still numbered around 4,000 troops. Colonel Ogata had ordered all troops to assemble in the wooded areas and high ground southeast of Tinian town for their last stand. The Americans knew on July 31st that they would face trouble. The terrain was difficult. A mile south of Tinian town, the ground rose to a high plateau thick with brush. The approaches were blocked by cliffs and a rainforest. On the east, the ground became cliff, so there was no flanking to be done. Through the middle ran a road, but it wound about, giving good views and weapons access from several points. And besides, said prisoners, it had been heavily mined. The west side offered the only sensible access, and this was also cliff, but cliff possible to scale. As General Schmidt half expected, on the night of July 30th, the Japanese staged an attack. 3 tanks led about 100 infantrymen against the lines of the 24th Marines. 1 tank was destroyed, scores of Japanese soldiers were killed, and the attack dissolved. It did emphasize the difficulties, and as dawn broke on July 31st, it came with the thunder of artillery. The Navy was called into action. Its guns fired 600 tons of shells against the relatively small wooded area of the south. In spite of the difficult weather, carrier bombers and land-based bombers from Saipan and the Tinian airfields dropped 69 tons of bombs. The Japanese, cornered in this end of Tinian, found the bombardment dreadful. Indeed, for the few who survived, the major memory was of weeks of intensive bombardment and shelling, and this was quite a correct assessment, because never before had the Central Pacific forces used so much artillery and naval fire to reduce an island. But someone had to take the territory, and that was the Marines. They faced a difficult cliff on the left. General Schmidt ringed the cliff with troops of the 2nd Division and told them to stay at the base to prevent Japanese escape along the east coast. The road, dangerous as it might be, offered the only sensible approach to the bastion area. As the troops began to move, they were slowed by the emergence of Korean and Japanese civilians who wanted to surrender. The 2nd Marines rounded them up. The 8th Marines led the way in the attack, supported by tanks. As they approached the plateau, they moved through flat cane fields along the railroad track. The Japanese resisted as well as they could. At one point, 15 soldiers rushed out from their hiding place along the embankment in a banzai charge against an American tank. In 5 minutes, there were 15 Japanese bodies on the ground, and the tank lumbered on. As they came to the cliffs and the road winding upward through them, the Japanese fire intensified. Riflemen and machine guns were hidden in deep caves and ravines, and as the first tanks and troops reached the edge of the rising ground, they began to fire. The rate and intensity of the fire were such that Lieutenant Colonel Gavin Humphrey, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Marines, stopped. He must find some way to reduce the fire from the ground above. Medium tanks came to upturn their 75 mm guns on the area. Their fire was not very effective. The Japanese simply retreated into their caves. Flamethrower tanks came up to try to burn away the vegetation that concealed the cave entrances. They were not very successful. The ground and the vegetation were too wet. Self-propelled 75 mm guns were brought up, and they did no more to resolve the problem than the tanks had done. Humphrey suggested to the regimental command post that he be allowed to withdraw his troops 400 yards to the rear and then bring down an artillery barrage on the whole area. It could not be done. The 1st Battalion of the regiment was on the right of the 3rd. It was growing late in the day, and to withdraw would leave a hole in the line that would invite a Japanese flank attack. So the Marines dug in for the night at the bottom of the high ground. The 1st Battalion actually fought its way up the road to the top. At least Company A reached the top and was followed by a platoon of Company C. Late in the afternoon, most of the battalion reached the high ground, but that did not mean they had captured it. The Japanese were all around them, and at 6:30 that evening they attacked. A force of about 100 riflemen came charging out of the brush. Most of them were killed, but as darkness fell, the American position was tenuous. The 8th Marines were strung out along the road from bottom to top. Colonel Clarence Wallace, commander of the regiment, sent 2 platoons of his reserve company and 2 37mm guns up to the top to reinforce the front position. It was here, he knew from experience, that he could expect the night assault that most surely would come. An hour before midnight, the attack began. The Japanese came quietly forward until they were 20 yards from the American positions. They harassed the front line from there. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese sent a force of about 100 men to cut the road. They crossed, burned 2 jeep ambulances, and captured a number of vehicles. From the base of the cliff, Major William C. Chamberlain led a counterattack up the road. They recaptured most of the vehicles and killed most of the Japanese. 20 Japanese soldiers, isolated by this attack, were found the next day, kamikaze by grenade. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese attacked again and were repelled. At 5:15, a group of more than 600 charged the Americans at the top of the hill. The 37mm guns began firing canister, which exploded and sent shrapnel over a wide area. The Japanese turned machine guns against the 37mm guns, and one 13mm gun tore large holes in the protective shield of one of the 37mm guns and killed the crew. But other Marines jumped in to man the guns, and they kept firing. The 2 37mm guns at the top of the hill made the difference. They fired steadily and kept the Japanese advance from materializing. In an hour of fighting, the Marines suffered 75 casualties, but the Japanese left 200 dead in an area about 100 yards square. They retreated into the woods and cliffs southeast of the Marine position. On the morning of July 31st, the tanks began to move again. They were stopped by high-velocity anti-tank fire that scored 6 hits on one tank in a few minutes. One of them penetrated the turret and wrecked it, but the tank was not destroyed. Its commander backed off about 15 yards and then fired smoke shells to show the area from which the high-velocity fire had come. The Japanese obviously had an anti-tank gun back there. The spotters, flying above the Marines in their observation planes, gave the coordinates to the destroyers and cruisers offshore. Bazookas were brought up to fire into the area. More tanks came up and fired their guns toward the woods. They seemed to have destroyed the gun, for the area became quiet. The tanks moved forward with a new tank on the left flank, where the one had been hit before. When they moved, the replacement tank had no sooner reached the spot where the first tank was hit than it too was hit 6 times in rapid succession. Then the tankers discovered the enemy gun in a fortified position 30 yards off to the left. 2 tanks moved out to destroy the gun. One fired a smoke shell into the position. The other moved behind the position and fired into the concrete wall of the back. Smoke came out, and so did a few Japanese, who were killed by the guns of the tank in front. The tank men then stopped to look over their enemy. The Japanese had put a 47mm anti-tank gun into a concrete emplacement, enclosed on 3 sides. The weapon was trained on a fire lane about 10 yards wide, through which any tanks would have to pass along this route. It had been a very effective position, but again the sheer power of numbers had made the difference. 2 American tanks had been damaged, but the Japanese had lost one of their few anti-tank weapons and 20 soldiers. The road was the key to capturing the area. The Japanese knew it and defended it and made it dangerous with mines. The Americans took the road and the engineers dug out the mines, and at night the Japanese infiltrated and laid new mines. At one point, when a tank hit a mine that shattered its suspension system and injured 3 of the crew, the Japanese came charging out from the brush to finish off the tank. But other tanks came up to rescue the crew of the stopped tank, and infantrymen kept the Japanese back. As they retreated, they saw the Japanese setting up a machine gun in the wrecked tank. They stopped, turned, and blew apart their own tank to prevent the enemy from using it. On the morning of August 1st, the drive continued. The 24th Marines were moving down the coast from Tinian town. It was tedious business, involving a few yards of advance, discovery of a cave filled with Japanese, and then the difficult process of routing them out, firing into the cave with 75 pack howitzers and flamethrowers, and perhaps finally having to seal the cave with a satchel charge before they could go on. Half the time they never saw the enemies they were killing, but the Japanese defences were stout. In one area, a dozen yards wide and 30 yards long, which the Marines had to traverse because of the rugged ground, the engineers cleared 45 mines. On the morning of August 1st, 3 battalions attacked across the plateau that had been fought over so hard during the previous day and night. Resistance suddenly seemed to stop, and hundreds of civilians appeared. This was not surprising, for after the Marines had watched with shock as women and children killed themselves on Saipan, they had launched a massive propaganda campaign on Tinian to prevent the same tragedy. On Saipan, the Japanese military had persuaded the civilians that they would all be murdered by the Americans, and they might as well die for the Emperor. Thousands of leaflets dropped by aircraft on Tinian before and during the campaign promised the civilians good treatment, and also promised the military that surrenders would be accepted and the prisoners treated under the rules of the Geneva Convention. So several thousand civilians, most of them from this southern part of the island and Tinian town in particular, began surrendering. The 6th Marine advance was stopped that day by the surrenders. The civilians were passed back through the lines and herded into concentration camps in the rear, where they were fed and given clothing if they needed it. A few needed medical attention, but very few had been hurt by the bombing that had flattened their town. By August 2nd, about 4,000 civilians had surrendered, along with about 50 Japanese soldiers and sailors. On the night of August 1st, too, the Japanese began a series of banzai charges without any objectives at all, which indicated the approaching end of organised resistance. They attacked the command post of the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Marines and killed the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel John W. Easley, and several other Marines. The Japanese were decimated. This pattern, however, was to continue. Many Japanese soldiers refused to quit. They hid out in caves or in the woods, waiting for a chance to strike some sort of blow against their enemies. Organised resistance ended in the first week of August, but resistance did not. Indeed, it was more difficult and painful than Saipan. Colonel Ogata was dead, and his staff dead or dispersed, but individuals and little bands fought on, even as the Americans began building B-29 facilities on Tinian. The 1st Battalion of the 8th Marines was left on the island to mop up. The process continued until the end of the year. More than 500 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed in the next 5 months, at a cost of 38 Marines dead and 125 wounded. The total casualties for the Americans in the capture of Tinian had been about 2,000 killed and wounded. No one knew exactly how many Japanese had died. The figure was somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000, but the caves and the sea alone could tell the story. When Admiral Spruance steamed over in the Indianapolis on July 20th to join the invasion forces heading for Guam, he was fulfilling a promise made 2.5 years earlier, that the Americans would come back and repossess the first piece of American territory seized by the Japanese. The invasion of Guam was the most symbolic step yet taken in the Central Pacific campaign. It was late in coming, first because of Admiral Ozawa's foray from the East Indies, which had upset the Marianas' timetable, but even more important because of the underestimation of the size of the Japanese defense force on Saipan. The Guam invasion had been planned for the employment of Marines, but the 27th Army Division had been the reserve. The 27th had been totally committed at Saipan, and after the battle had suffered so many casualties that nothing short of desperation could have brought about the division's employment. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz designated the 77th Army Division to replace the 27th as the Central Pacific Force Reserve, but the problem was then logistics. The 77th, in intensive amphibious training, General Richardson could learn, after all, had to be supplied and organised for combat and transported to Guam. This all took time. The 3 Amphibious Corps was to be the landing force for Guam. Major General Roy S. Geiger would command the troops ashore, and Rear Admiral Connolly would get them there with his Southern Attack Force. The troops came mostly from the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, which had absorbed a number of organizations, including the Marine Raider battalions. The Raiders had been the Marines' super shock troops and had fought at Guadalcanal. Colonel Evans Carlson had led a Raider raid on Macon back in 1942, which became more and more controversial and contributed finally to the disbandment of the Raider battalions. The Marines did not like trick outfits, and by 1944 had decided to have no more of them. Guam, said all concerned, was going to be a different dish of tea from all these other Central Pacific islands. The Americans had been in possession of the island from 1898 to 1941, and so the problem of maps did not seem serious. They had plenty of maps and charts since the days of the old coaling station, which had been the Navy's principal reason for wanting Guam in the first place. The governor of Guam had traditionally been a naval officer, and the Navy and Marines had the run of the place. Chamorros, the natives of the Marianas, were relatively well treated and could be expected to show a loyalty to the Americans that had not been an aspect of any other island campaign to date. But Guam presented a new sort of problem to the Central Pacific forces. It was the largest piece of land they had yet set out to conquer, the biggest island north of the equator between Hawaii and the Philippines, 3 times the size of Saipan. The terrain ranged from high plateau, mountains and cliffs in the south, to a lesser plateau covered with hardwoods and dense tropical vegetation in the north. The Americans had been careless in the peaceful years and had not prepared really useful topographical maps. Consequently, when Guam was placed on the Central Pacific agenda, the intelligence officers began scurrying for information. Submarines were assigned to take profile photographs. The air photo services were sent to Guam to take a series of grid photographs. Old-line naval and marine officers who had served on the island were brought out of retirement to draw maps and correct errors in others. By the summer of 1944, the planners at Pearl Harbor had a fair idea, but no more than that, of the topography. They did not know much about the coral reef outside, except that it virtually circled the island. They knew even less about the Japanese defences, but the hiatus caused by the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the miscalculation of Japanese strength on Saipan worked to help the invaders of Guam. By July 14th, the underwater teams were swimming around the island. They destroyed about 1,000 obstacles off Asan and Agat on the west side of the island, where the invasion would be mounted. The fact that there were so many man-made obstacles along the reef was an indication of the Japanese plans for defense. Those plans were relatively new. After the Japanese seized Guam in 1941, they paid little attention to the island. A force of less than 200 naval troops was left to guard the installations. The army did not consider Guam important to the defences, and besides, the army was not thinking about defences, for it was driving forward on all fronts, and generals in Tokyo were talking about setting up in Sydney. But as it became apparent that the Americans were going to attack either the Gilberts or the Marshalls, as they did in the summer of 1943, Imperial headquarters in Tokyo had some second thoughts. The 29th Division of Manchuria's famous Kwantung Army was assigned to Guam, and before its officers began to prepare, they were warned by Tokyo that their job was vital to the defense of the empire. Loss of these islands signifies Japan's surrender. The division, which had been operating on the old lines with strict division of authority between infantry, engineers, tanks, and service troops, was reorganized along the lines of the American regimental combat teams. Each regiment had its own engineers and artillery. Then, in February 1944, the 29th Division was brought down from Manchuria, where it had been training for war against the Soviets and outfitted for war in the tropics. The division was loaded aboard 3 big transports at Busan, Korea. The 18th Infantry boarded the Sakito Maru, the 50th Infantry boarded another ship of the same size, and the 38th Infantry and Division headquarters boarded a third ship. They all sailed for the Marianas in February. Just 2 days out of port, the Sakito Maru was spotted by the American submarine Trout, which sank her, with a loss of more than half the 3,500 men aboard, including the regimental commander. The regiment also lost its artillery, tanks, and heavy equipment, so before any fighting had been done, the 38th was reduced to scattering in the Marianas. One battalion stayed on Saipan, where it was lost almost to the last man. The other 2 battalions and headquarters went to Guam. They had 2 companies of tanks, but only about 1,300 men. The 50th Regiment had gone to Tinian, where it suffered the fate of the Saipan defenders. Division headquarters went to Guam with the 38th Infantry, adding another 3,000 men to the defences. Then, because of the disaster that had befallen the Sakito Maru, Imperial headquarters dredged up another force from the rapidly dwindling resources of the Kwantung Army. Parts of the 1st and 11th Divisions were detached and assigned a new name, the 6th Expeditionary Force. But in spite of the big name, when the troops arrived in Guam, there were about 3,000 of them, and they were again reorganized into the 48th Independent Mixed Brigade and the 10th Independent Mixed Regiment. Altogether, by June 1944, the Defence Force had been raised to 11,500 men. Commander of the whole defence was Lieutenant General Rakeshi Takashima. General Obata, commander of the 31st Army, was in overall charge, but Takashima ran the Guam defences. The Navy also had a large force on the island, about 2,500 men under Captain Yutaka Sugimoto, who had been commander of the island before 1943. So, adding up Navy, Army, and odd units of survivors from various disasters, the total military presence on Guam in July 1944 was around 19,000. With the capture of Saipan, a good deal of information about Guam defences fell into American hands. The Japanese were expecting invasion by 4 or 5 American divisions on the west side of the island. The problem of defence was the paucity of artillery. General Takashima had a few 150 mm guns, but the preponderance were no larger than 75 mm, and there could never be enough of these. Beginning in the fall of 1943, the naval battalions and civilian construction crews had built a network of defensive pillboxes, spiderweb trench systems, and all the refinements they could muster. A central communications system was planned for construction underground, and work was begun. The delay in the invasion, then, worked not only for the Americans, but probably even more for the Japanese. Aerial photographs in the early spring had shown little defence. Those taken in the early summer showed 51 artillery emplacements, 36 anti-aircraft positions, and 141 machine gun and mortar posts, all fortified. And these were only the unconcealed positions that the American aviators were able to photograph with enough clarity so that the intelligence officers could identify them. There were many surprises, including a system of defences that was built to deny access of the Americans to the northern half of the island, and particularly to Orote Peninsula, which juts out into Apra Harbour, the principal port of Guam. Off and on, since early June, the Americans had been bombing and shelling Guam. The systematic bombardment of the island began on July 8th and continued day after day. All that had gone before, in the Marshalls and at Saipan and Tinian, was less than what came here. The bombardment was so intensive and so continuous that it virtually stopped Japanese work on the defences during the daylight hours and hampered it at night. As bad as this was, the effect on the morale of the troops was worse. The constant noise and surprise of shells coming in played havoc with the men's nerves. It was near the limit bearable by humans, said several of the survivors. As the Americans were ready to invade, they were satisfied that they had knocked out all the major Japanese defences. More than 50% of the installations they could see from the air or along the shore were destroyed. Aircraft coming in from the carriers and from land bases kept the Japanese troops' movements down to night manoeuvres. But the bombardment was so widely scattered that it was not until July 16th that the defenders had a real idea of where the Americans planned to land. On that day, the entire force was redirected along the west coast, particularly around Tumon Bay. General Takashima realized that the Americans were approaching this area. Having learned from the Saipan experience, the Americans assembled a strong force for the capture of Guam. By July, 37,000 Marines and 19,000 Army soldiers were prepared for the fight. They would land on the 2 best beaches of the island, Asan north of Apra Harbour, and Agat across Orote Peninsula south of the harbour. Admiral Connolly, the bombardment expert, stated from the outset that his goal was to get the troops ashore standing up, meaning he intended to destroy so much of the Japanese shore defence that there would be minimal casualties on the beach. In the week before the invasion, he had done his best to achieve this. On July 21st at 5:30 in the morning, 4 battleships off Orote Peninsula opened fire, each using a dozen 14-inch guns, while the old Pennsylvania fired at the cliff line inside Agat Bay. Other ships, including cruisers and destroyers, joined in the bombardment of the beaches. Each ship targeted specific zones and objectives. 45 minutes after the barrage began, a dozen fighter planes, 9 dive bombers and 5 torpedo bombers from the carriers attacked targets on Cabras Island north of Apra Harbour. At 7:15, a more spectacular display occurred. 85 fighters, 62 dive bombers, and 53 torpedo bombers from the carriers flew along the beaches, bombing and strafing. For the first time, planes successfully arrived during the naval bombardment. The experience at Eniwetok and Saipan, where planes had been damaged or destroyed by friendly fire, led to an experiment where naval gunners adjusted their trajectories so that no shell rose above 1,200 feet and the flyers pulled out of their runs at 1,500 feet. This adjustment worked very well. The landing force was already assembling. The 1st Marine Provisional Brigade was to land on the Agat beaches, and the 3rd Marine Division on the Asan beaches. The procedures followed the well-established pattern. Guam was, after all, the Central Pacific Force's 10th amphibious landing. The sequence included a barrage from the ships, followed by gunboats, and then 360 LVTs. At 8 o'clock in the morning, as the assault boats moved toward land, the air observer flying over the island to spot for the 3rd Marine Division saw no signs of Japanese activity. There was no Japanese fire coming from the shore towards the ships. In the 1st Brigade's area, 1 gun was observed firing, prompting the 14-inch guns of the battleships to target Yonah Island, where the fire was coming from. However, as the Marines approached the last few yards of water separating the reef from the beach, the situation suddenly changed. Several amphibious tractors were disabled by underwater mines that exploded in the faces of the men. The beach defences, which were supposed to be destroyed, came to life. Off the northern shore, guns ranging from 75 mm to 37 mm suddenly opened fire. Several amphibious tractors were hit. Marines jumped and began wading into the beach. Admiral Connolly's hope of getting them in with dry feet was dashed. The Japanese were firing armour-piercing shells and bullets, and the LVTs were hit. As the Marines exited them, Japanese machine guns fired on the beaches. In the 1st and 2nd waves, dozens of LVTs were hit, and 10 were destroyed. In the south, in the 1st Brigade's area, 10 more were destroyed. The ship's guns found the enemy positions and began shelling them. But the defences on Guam were the most secure that the Americans had yet encountered. An effective gun position was located on Garn Point inside a coral hill. It had not been seen from the air, but when the invasion troops landed, its effect was felt almost immediately. Embedded in 4 feet of rock, one 75 mm gun and a 37 mm gun fired down on the beach. Colonel Carvel Hall's 3rd Marines were tasked with securing Adelup Point, Chonito Cliff, and the high ground on the left flank of the division. The 21st Marines would move inland, and on the right the 9th Marines would take the low ground and Cabras Island. In the south, the 1st Provisional Brigade would land on the other side of the Orote Peninsula. The 22nd Marines would occupy Agat, with the 4th Marines on their right flank and the 305th Marines turning north to seize the Orote Peninsula and link up with the 3rd Division in the north. Before the landing, the naval officers had been congratulating one another on the smoothness of their operation, the best yet. But as the Marines came ashore and began to fall on the beaches, it became apparent that the Japanese had been more clever than the intelligence officers had believed. Dozens of guns and machine guns had survived the barrage and bombing by the carrier and land-based aircraft. At Adelup Point, the fire on the 3rd Marines was ominously heavy, as one observer put it. An observer counted 20 disabled amphibious tractors in the water off the beach. Still, by 8:30, the Marines were ashore and moving along the beach, firing their weapons. The 3rd Marines faced the hardest resistance. The Japanese had retreated during the bombardment to caves and shelters on the reverse slopes of the hills. But when the guns lifted to let the Marines land, the Japanese emerged from their caves and took up prepared positions on Chonito Cliff, which overlooked the beaches and ground to the south. They manned field guns, mortars, and machine guns that were sighted in on the reef and beaches, resulting in many casualties for the 3rd Marines. Soon the cry of corpsmen began ringing in the air, and the number of litters allocated was used up. The Marines began making litters from poles and ponchos to carry their wounded back to the beach. The Japanese had built one strongpoint that ran between Adelup Point and Chonito Cliff. They had dug a tunnel system 400 yards long, with guns covering a concrete bridge and the beach road. From their positions they could fire on the beach, and if the Marines got off the beach and came to the road, they could fire on the vehicles moving south. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Marines faced this fire. Company L was stopped by the Japanese at the draw leading inland to the road. Company K crossed the bed of a dry stream and started up Chonito Cliff, but the Japanese fired down on them, and when the Marines lobbed grenades uphill, the Japanese rolled them back down. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Hauser, the battalion commander, called for flamethrowers and tanks. They arrived and began firing into the caves. One by one, the positions were destroyed, with the Japanese moving on to the next. By noon, the Americans had taken Chonito Cliff. In the afternoon, they took Adelup Point. However, the advance was stalled by a Japanese strongpoint located on a rock pile 200 yards square and 400 feet high. Company A of the 1st Battalion ran into this position, which had been named Bunshu Ridge in honor of Captain Geary Bunshu, commander of Company A. On the morning of July 21st, Captain Bunshu might have declined the honor, as his troops were heavily hit by fire from this position. Despite this, they moved ahead, with 2 platoons assaulting and 1 in reserve. At 9:20, the 2 lead platoons were pinned down in a gully below the ridge by Japanese machine gun and mortar fire. The support platoon was sent around to the east side on the left. The casualties were so heavy that Bunshu called for more corpsmen and stretcher-bearers from the rear. On the right of the hill, Company B fared slightly better, but still faced heavy losses. 5 men were killed from that company that day. When resistance at Adelup Point ceased, the 81 mm mortars of the 1st Battalion were turned over to this area. However, when the mortarmen moved up to the ridge, they were almost immediately pinned down by Japanese fire from above. The gunnery sergeant and 4 men were hit within minutes. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the attack was stalled. Colonel Hall committed the 2nd Battalion to the area. Captain Bunshu of Company A could not advance, and at 2 o'clock requested permission to disengage, withdraw, and try another approach. However, Colonel Hall denied the request, stating that the company was right in the middle of the line, and its withdrawal would jeopardize the troops on either side. Therefore, Captain Bunshu led a charge up the hill. Japanese machine guns rattled and mortars spat their charges into the air. Captain Bunshu fell dead as a handful of his men reached the crest of the hill. Colonel James Snedeker, executive officer of the 3rd Marines, was sitting on a sand dune with a portable radio, spotting for the 40 mm anti-aircraft guns being used to support the troops in the absence of Japanese planes. He saw the Marines falling down the hill and little puffs of sand rising all around as Japanese fire intensified. As night fell, the Japanese still held Bunshu Ridge, and their fire from it continued throughout the night. Elsewhere, the situation was not much different. The arc of hills around the Asan beachhead was sternly defended by the Japanese. As night came, the Americans found themselves with 2 separate operations ashore. The 3rd Marines and the 1st Brigade had not been able to link up. The Japanese still held Orote Peninsula. The 21st Marines faced similar difficulties as the 3rd Regiment, and they called the ridge they were fighting for Banzai Ridge. By nightfall, they had a slender hold on one bit of ridge top, and were in contact with the 9th Marines on their right. The 9th Marines had encountered less resistance and made the most progress of the division, moving through dry rice paddies to the ridge extending from Asan Point to the mouth of the Nidual River and toward the Tatgua River. By dark, the troops had dug in 400 yards from the bank. The amount of territory gained and the speed of the advance were deceptive. The 9th Marines had the advantage of easier terrain, but paid a heavy price for their advance. 20 officers were killed or wounded, and 211 men. The commanders of 2 companies of the 3rd Battalion were among the dead. By the end of the day, the 3rd Division had suffered 105 men killed, 536 wounded, and 56 missing in action. The division held a beachhead 2.5 miles wide and about a mile deep at its point of farthest penetration. However, this picture was illusory, as the Japanese still held high points throughout the area and could fire down on the beachhead, harassing and killing men coming ashore. Despite this, the Marines were determined to stay, as Major General Alan Turnage set up his divisional command post ashore. In the south, the 1st Brigade faced easier terrain but stronger Japanese resistance. Despite the naval barrage, many pillboxes remained intact, and from them and the intricate trench system came a wave of fire as the Marines landed. The tanks began to fall into traps. Nevertheless, by noon, the 22nd Marines had advanced to high ground 1,000 yards inland. Here they were, out of range of the guns firing on the beach, but they faced a new danger, artillery fire from the hills. It grew stronger as they moved inland. The 2nd Battalion advanced around noon to seize the first day's objective, a line that included the village of Agat. However, Japanese guns stopped them. When the battalion commander ordered an airstrike from a carrier, the bombs fell on Company F, killing and wounding several men. The attack had to be abandoned, and the battalion dug in for the night instead of meeting the 1st Battalion at Agat. The 1st Battalion took the rubble of the village, but then Company C ran into serious trouble. They were receiving fire from a concealed Japanese position 50 yards away on a small hill. They had to withdraw to a series of Japanese trenches below the hill, where they were pinned down and still uncertain of the machine gun locations. As darkness fell, 12 Japanese soldiers, carrying 3 heavy machine guns and a light machine gun, marched down a trail leading to the trench. These were the guns that had halted the company all afternoon. The Japanese were apparently moving them forward, believing the Americans had retreated to the beach. Company C's riflemen began shooting, killing all 12 Japanese. "Those Japanese were so heavy with slugs we couldn't lift them," said one Marine. In the 22nd's area, life had been complicated all day and continued to be so. Heavy Japanese fire on the beach had wrecked many amphibious tractors, delaying the delivery of supplies and reinforcements. A shell had hit an aid station, destroying medical supplies and killing or wounding all members of the party. The night was spent trying to catch up. The 4th Marines landed on flat ground after hitting the beaches, and soon advanced 700 yards inland. By noon, they had reached their first objective. In the afternoon, they moved toward Mount Alifan, and before nightfall reached the foot of the mountain and dug in. Casualties amounted to about 350 men killed and wounded, but they had no clear idea of Japanese casualties, as they saw very few bodies. The same was true in the north. The Americans had little knowledge of what they faced. However, they were ashore. The 305th Marines, in reserve, came ashore in the afternoon and evening. By the end of the first day, the invasion was established. The Japanese had suffered more casualties than the Marines could locate. The 38th Regiment had been severely impacted. 2 companies of the 1st Battalion in the Agat Beach area had been wiped out by noon by the 4th Marines. The 2nd Battalion had suffered many casualties trying to hold Agat and had failed to secure the town. As Colonel Tsuentaro Swenaga, the regimental commander, pondered the battle that evening in his command post on the slope of Mount Alifan, he saw that the Americans had moved far inland and threatened to take the entire sector he was entrusted with. The only answer was a counterattack to regain the lost territory and drive the Marines back to the beach. It had to happen that night, before the Marines had a chance to bring in more men, tanks and guns. He sent orders to the platoons and squads of the 1st and 2nd Battalions to prepare for a counterattack. Then he telephoned General Takashima to ask permission to attack. The general refused, stating that the regiment had been badly hurt during the day and was in no condition to make such an attack. But Colonel Suenaga argued that it was now or never. In the morning the Marines would advance again, and he could not hold out long against such overwhelming power. Thus the general was persuaded to allow an attack he knew would likely fail. His last words to Suenaga were to ensure that whatever was left must go to Mount Alifan to continue the defence. Suenaga obviously knew what was coming, for he burned the regimental colours to ensure they were not captured by the enemy. As darkness fell, the word was passed along the Marine line to be ready for a banzai charge in any and every section. The artillery zeroed in on all avenues of approach. Offshore, the ships took positions to support the troops. Just before midnight, mortar shells began falling on Company K of the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Marines. The Japanese charged forth. Flares were sent up, revealing scores of screaming Japanese coming at full tilt with bayonets and swords. 6 Marines in forward foxholes were overrun and bayoneted to death before the fire intensified and drove the Japanese back. All along the line, the story was repeated. The Japanese charged, killed Marines, and were then killed or driven into retreat by artillery and machine guns. Some Japanese with explosives reached the beach and blew up 2 weapons carriers and 3 LVTs before being surrounded and killed by Marines. The 4th Marines Tank Company was also targeted. The Japanese attempted to destroy the tanks, but the Marines killed 23 of them without losing a tank. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the Marines of the 4th Regiment's 2nd Battalion heard the rumble of tanks along the beach road. They sent out a call for help, and Marine tanks arrived. Half an hour later, a line of Japanese light tanks reached the battle line. Star shells from the ships offshore illuminated the area in a greenish light, making the Japanese tanks clearly visible. Bazooka men and several 37mm anti-tank guns began firing at point-blank range. The first 2 enemy tanks were hit by 1 bazooka gunner, who was killed by return fire. The 75mm guns of the Sherman tanks hit 2 more tanks, causing them to burn. The tank assault failed. Throughout the Marine line, the attack was repeated. The 1st Battalion of the 4th Marines endured heavy assaults. Company A repelled multiple charges by Japanese troops rushing down the wooded slopes of the mountain. 1 rifle platoon was reduced to 4 able-bodied men. The brigade lost 50 men killed and 100 wounded, but the commander estimated that the Japanese lost 4 times as many men. The 38th Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Shigematsu of the 48th Independent Mixed Brigade took control of most of the troops in this area and staged additional attacks that night. He set up his command post in a quarry off the Fonte River Valley Road. As reinforcements arrived, he sent them to join the battle. The Marines held their ground, and by morning the Japanese 10th and 18th Infantry Regiments had suffered losses. In the most serious thrust, made against the Marines at Chonito Cliff, some Japanese attacked frontally, while others moved down the dry stream bed between Adlup Point and the cliff. They attempted to climb the slopes behind the Marines. However, the Marines of the 3rd held firm with support from a company of the 21st Marines and LVTs on the beach. By 8:30 in the morning, the attack was sealed off, and the Japanese attackers were being picked off one by one. On the 2nd day, July 22nd, the Marines had scheduled an advance, but could not move forward due to the Japanese still holding Bunshu Ridge. On the right, the 9th Marines advanced into the flats beyond Asan Point, taking the villages of Tapungan and Piti, as well as the Piti Navy Yard. They moved to Cabras Island at the mouth of the harbour. The Japanese allowed them to land unopposed, but soon faced thick brush and mines. Bunshu Ridge was the major problem. General Tumage's men fought all day to gain control of the height, but were unable to do so. The Japanese defence positions were carefully planned, and wherever the Marines moved, the Japanese fired on them, preventing further advance. As night fell, General Toumaj began planning an all-out assault on the ridge. The Japanese unintentionally assisted him. Lieutenant Colonel Hideyuki Takeda, the operations officer of the 29th Division, aimed to make a showing against the Marines and, if possible, push them back farther off the slopes of the ridge. He instructed the 321st Independent Infantry Battalion to make an attack that night. The plan was for the Japanese to sneak up to the American line, blast it with grenades, and then withdraw in confusion. However, the Japanese officers grew over-enthusiastic and charged the American lines with their troops behind them. Machine guns, mortars, and field guns behind the Marine lines began firing. By morning, Colonel Takeda could count only 50 survivors of the 500-man battalion. By July 23rd, the Japanese position had deteriorated more than it might have seemed in terms of numbers. Thousands of troops remained on the island, brave and ready to give their lives, but the best fighting men, the troops of the 29th Division and the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, were dead. The Japanese field hospital in the valley below Mount Makina was overcrowded with wounded men. The Fonte River, usually a source of drinking water, could not be used due to contamination from rotting bodies. General Takashima knew this and decided to stage a major attack before his reserves were exhausted by continuous fighting. At that moment, the Marines advanced in small spurts. It was not until the fourth day that they had closed the gaps in the line of the 3rd Division. On July 22nd, the attack on Orote Peninsula began, as it had to be cleared to consolidate the lines of the 3rd Division and the 1st Brigade. The plan was to move across the neck of the peninsula and seal it off. The advance was stoutly contested by the Japanese, leading to the involvement of the 77th Army Division from the ships. The 305th and 306th Regimental Combat Teams began to land. By July 25th, the Japanese decided to move to prevent such sealing off. The 9th Marines and the 21st Marines bore the brunt of a Japanese counterattack near the Mount Tenjo road. By the end of July 25th, the Marine reserves were completely exhausted. Every man of the 1st Battalion of the 21st Marines was on the line in a combat position. They were nearly exhausted after 4 days of constant fighting. It was on this night that General Takashima chose to stage his major counterattack. The first move came at midnight against the reconnaissance company of the 3rd Marines. General Takashima had planned for the tanks to advance first, followed by the infantry breaching the line and charging through to seal off the American flank. However, the tanks got lost and never arrived. Naval troops of the 54th Keibatai, assault battalion, were led forward by Captain Yutaki Sugimoto, the senior Japanese naval officer, who was killed in the assault along with hundreds of his men. Although the Japanese managed to breach the lines and destroy some American equipment, including a tank, they were overwhelmed by American reserves, material, guns, and support from the beaches and sea. They could not hold positions in the American rear. That night, the Japanese attacked the American hospital near the Nijuel River, killing and wounding many of the already wounded and the hospital personnel. By morning, the Marines estimated that they had killed over 3,000 Japanese. Unbeknownst to them, the enemy had suffered a serious blow with the deaths of many senior Japanese officers. General Shigematsu, commander of the 48th Brigade, was killed when Marine tanks blasted his command post. The commander of the 18th Regiment was killed leading his troops, and both of his battalion commanders were killed after they had led troops behind American lines. On July 26th, General Obata sent dispirited news to Tokyo, signalling impending disaster. "I will defend Mount Mangan to the last by assembling the remaining strength." Tokyo understood that the battle was lost, and that it was only a matter of time. With 95% of the officers killed and 90% of the weapons lost, the Orote Peninsula Defense Force was wiped out, and the Americans now held the entire Agate sector of the island. There was no hope for naval or air support for the Japanese. All that remained was a campaign of attrition to make the American recapture of Guam as costly as possible. On July 29th, the American flag was raised on Guam for the first time since 1941, above the ruins of the old Marine barracks on Orote. Planes began landing on the Orote Peninsula airfield. The Marines and Army troops moved out, fanning out to secure the island. Major Japanese forces retreated to the northern half of the island after their defeat at Orote Peninsula. General Obata, the military commander for the area, who had been caught on Guam by the offensive, moved his headquarters to Ordot, just above the center of the island. General Takashima, commander of the 29th Division, was trapped in a cave in the Fonte area, escaped by jumping off a cliff, and was later shot down by a tank machine gunner as he reached the foot of Mount Mahasina. General Obata then assumed tactical command of the Guam forces for the first time. For several days, General Geiger stopped to rest and reorganize his troops. The size of Guam made this campaign different from previous ones. Even as the Japanese were on the defensive and retreating, there was ample space for them to fall back. Hundreds of Japanese stragglers were holed up in the south and central parts of the island, endangering every American movement. On July 30th, as the Americans reorganized, they counted the cost. They had suffered 6,000 casualties in the battle for Guam, and the island was only half won. The Japanese dead they could account for numbered over 6,000, and they had taken only 50 prisoners, a grim reminder of Japan's tenacity. The terrain to the north was even more challenging than to the south, with rolling hills covered in dense brush and underbrush. On July 31st, Marines and Army troops advanced against Agana, the island's capital. By nightfall, they held the town plaza and the surrounding shattered buildings, bypassing many Japanese in the hills and gullies who were unaware of the American advance. As usual, when American units encountered Japanese, the latter fought fiercely and were often killed to the last man. The troops moved along the roads, taking villages, while the Japanese continued to occupy large parts of Guam. There were fights around Mount Barrigada, Mount Mataguoc, and Mount Santa Rosa. General Obata ordered his men to fight delaying actions at every one of these points. General Geiger wanted artillery support, but the thick jungle limited the effectiveness of battleship and cruiser shells. Saipan-based B-25 medium bombers and P-47 fighters were deployed to bomb and drop napalm. Army and Marine artillery moved up behind the troops, and the Americans slugged their way northward on Guam. The nature of the fighting was exemplified on August 3rd in the area occupied by the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Marines. They reached the Finagayan-Barrigada Road and a crossroads where the roads from Agana and Barrigada met. As long as they stayed on the road, they encountered relatively few Japanese, who were posted at significant points like road crossings and villages. On the afternoon of August 3rd, when the Marines reached the Finagayan-Barrigada junction, they stopped because it presented new problems. Major Jess Ferrell, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 9th Marines, had no contact with the Army troops on his right. The 3rd Battalion of the 21st Marines was then sent up behind the Ferrell unit, and they dug in for the night. Major Ferrell wanted to assess the situation along the side roads, so an armoured reconnaissance force was organised that afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Hartnell Withers of the 3rd Tank Battalion brought up several Sherman medium tanks, 2 half-tracks, 4 radio jeeps, and several truckloads of troops, including a mine-clearing detachment and Company 1 of the 21st Marines. The patrol unit went out on the road but got sidetracked onto a small market road leading east to Liguan. 400 yards past the crossroads, Japanese forces ambushed the American vehicles on both sides of the road. For 2 hours, the force was cut off from retreat, with limited visibility of the enemy who had field guns, machine guns, mortars, and many riflemen. The jungle prevented the Shermans from manoeuvring, and the half-tracks were in a similar predicament. The trucks could not turn around. The Americans dug in and fought, finally knocking out a Japanese tank and a pair of 75 mm guns. They managed to break loose and retreat, leaving behind 1 wrecked half-track and 1 truck, and carrying 15 casualties. This pattern of fighting was repeated many times, along with night attacks that harried them. At 10 p.m. that night, 2 medium Japanese tanks came down the Liguan Road into the American positions, firing steadily as they sped westward up another road, escaping despite return fire from all types of American weapons. The 77th Division faced even rougher conditions due to the few roads in their sector, meaning they moved northward over rough terrain. Tanks and bulldozers came up behind, making roads for supplies. They surrounded Mount Barrigada, and by the afternoon of August 4th, American forces were ready to drive northward again. The Japanese retreated north and east, fighting furiously. Their tanks were particularly effective at night. On August 6th, in an encounter similar to that on the Liguan Road, the Japanese sent 2 medium tanks and a platoon of infantry into a position held by the 305th Infantry Regiment. Despite American gunfire, the Japanese tanks sped down the trail, damaging a Sherman tank, crushing a jeep, and leaving 15 American dead and 46 wounded, with no apparent Japanese casualties. One of the worst aspects of the fighting on Guam was the Japanese ability to elude pursuers in the jungle, making their snipers exceptionally deadly. Japanese snipers caused heavy casualties, particularly among key personnel. On August 6th, a sniper shot down Colonel Douglas C. McNair, the Chief of Staff of the 77th Division, as he was setting up a new command post. The next moment, the colonel was dead from a bullet, and the jungle from which it came was silent. The Americans eventually took the Liguan Road. They took Mount Barrigada and the roads that led past to Mount Mataguac and Mount Santa Rosa. Bombers and naval artillery concentrated on these points ahead, and the Japanese who defended them, and survived, said, as had those at Tinian and Saipan, that the constant bombing and shelling was almost more than they could bear. But they did bear it, and they fought on. On August 7th, the Americans cleaned out the area around the 77th Division command post where Colonel McNair had fallen, discovering that their headquarters was in the middle of a Japanese stronghold. Not 500 yards away was a company of Japanese troops, totally unobserved until American riflemen and tanks came upon them during the search. It took 6 hours of close fighting before the last shot was heard, and the Americans counted their casualties, 33 dead and wounded. The Americans moved forward, sometimes swiftly, sometimes haltingly, but they moved. The Japanese counterattacked time and again, but never successfully. All they could do was fight a delaying action and cause casualties, which they did very well indeed. Their tanks came out at unexpected moments, seldom more than 1 or 2 at a time, made a foray, and then retreated. They lost tanks and men, and attrition worked both ways. On August 8th, the Americans of the 305th and 307th Infantry Regiments took Mount Santa Rosa. The Japanese had moved out. Compressed into an ever smaller area, they became more savage. The Americans encountered the battered bodies of many Chamorros, beheaded. These had been labourers pressed into building the Japanese defences, and apparently the enemy had killed them to prevent them from talking to the Americans. By August 8th, Mount Mataguac had fallen, and the last Japanese stronghold lay in the 3rd Marine Division's zone of the island. It included tanks and many troops. The Marines were told that Admiral Nimitz was coming to inspect Guam, and that they needed to hurry with the cleanup. They did. They moved into the area, knocked out some Japanese tanks, established a straggler line across the island from Fardian Point to a point north of Tumun Bay, about a third of the island, and declared Guam secured. On August 10th, General Geiger said, "That afternoon Admiral Nimitz arrived by air at Orate Airfield. It would not have done otherwise for his visit. In terms of control, the island was secure, but General Obata was still alive north of the straggler line, and thousands of Japanese soldiers were still alive around the island." On the morning of August 10th, as Admiral Nimitz was flying toward Guam, General Obata sent his last message for Japan, containing the now predictable personal apologies to the Emperor for the loss of the Marianas. On the 11th, he said he would engage in the last desperate battle on the slopes of Mount Mataguac, where he would die with his soldiers. On the morning of August 11th, the troops of the 306th Infantry attacked behind tanks and moved steadily along the slopes of the mountain. The Japanese simply did not have the guns and tanks to resist the American armour. Sometime during the morning, General Obata committed seppuku. In the only way he knew, he atoned to his emperor for the failure to defend the islands. But if Guam was secure on August 11, 1944, it was not a very comfortable sort of security. An estimated 10,000 Japanese were still alive on the island. True, they had relatively few heavy weapons, and they were scattered in groups of no more than company size. As the days went on, they suffered from a lack of supply, for there was absolutely nothing for them anywhere. The Chamorros, by and large, were their enemies. The Japanese had abused them over the past 3 years, and even changed the name of their island, so the natives had no love for the Japanese. Literally, the Japanese starved. In the months to come, the Americans used Guam as a live ammunition training center. The mopping up gave combat troops new skills. But what was to be done? The Japanese would not surrender. When they saw Americans, they shot at them. Perhaps a massive propaganda campaign might have produced some results, but it is doubtful. Long after the war ended, Japanese stragglers were still being unearthed from the jungles of Guam, and some managed to survive for years there. By mid-August, however, the war had taken an entirely new turn, and Guam was to play a role. It would become the advance headquarters of the Central Pacific Forces, and Admiral Nimitz would move there to direct operations. Inside a year, Guam would house 200,000 American troops. Finally, the casualties of Guam were counted. In 21 days of battle, the Marines, who bore the assault in the beginning, had 7,000 killed and wounded. The Army suffered about 1,000 casualties. The Americans counted 11,000 Japanese bodies, but many more were sealed in caves. The propaganda campaign of later months did bring some Japanese out of hiding. By the end of the war, 1,250 Japanese had surrendered, most of them starving. But finally, the Americans counted 18,500 Japanese dead on Guam, which meant that another 8,000 soldiers and sailors had starved or been killed after the island was lost. For several reasons, the Marianas operation marked a major change in the American approach to the Pacific War. While General Holland Smith and his commanders were taking the Marianas, General Douglas MacArthur went to Pearl Harbor to meet with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Admiral Nimitz in a historic conference. At Pearl Harbor, General MacArthur managed to convince the president to follow a war program that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had rejected, to move to the Philippines, not to Formosa or China as Nimitz and Admiral King wished to do, and then to move against Japan. On the military side, MacArthur's argument was strengthened by the kind of war that had been waged in the Marianas. These were larger bodies of land than any the Central Pacific Forces had assaulted earlier. The assault on a large land area demanded different techniques. The Marines' fierce driving on the smaller islands would not work here. The slower army advance, along a broad front, was what would be needed. While General Holland Smith had led his men successfully so far, the quarrel with General Ralph Smith emphasized a major problem within the armed forces. The army was deeply resentful of the relief of Ralph Smith, and that resentment was felt throughout Army Washington. In the end, however, it was the politics of war that turned the direction of the Americans in the Pacific. President Roosevelt saw the political advantages of redeeming General MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines, advantages to be reaped in the war effort and on the home political front. Roosevelt was the consummate politician, just as General MacArthur was the consummate political general. The Pearl Harbor meeting ended with the president deciding that the Army and General MacArthur would lead, and that the Central Pacific Forces would move into a position of support. It was a bitter pill for Admiral King to swallow, for he had hoped to have the Navy lead the way to Tokyo. Admiral Nimitz was disappointed, but cheerfully moved into what would become a new role. Admiral Spruance would not lead the way, and the fleet would become a fleet once more, not a major military command. All this had been decided by the time Admiral Nimitz came to Guam in August. Spruance was relieved, and the forces were turned over to Admiral William F. Halsey and called the Third Fleet. Most of the ships were the same, the new battleships, the fast carriers, and the cruisers and destroyers. Halsey would prepare for the invasion of the Palau Islands, which had been indicated as the new Japanese command area for the Outer Empire. In fact, the Palaus would turn out to be a paper tiger, the Japanese having withdrawn to the Philippines, Okinawa, and Formosa. The war would go on in the Central Pacific, and the Navy would carry a big load. But with the capture of the Marianas, the Central Pacific forces ceased to be the prime element of the American effort, and their role would never again be the same. If there is a lasting value to this history of Central Pacific operations, it is to show the development of the Pacific War and the reasons that it took the direction it did after July 1944, when the High Command reversed its policy and decided to move through the Philippines instead of China. What would have happened if Nimitz and King had been victorious in that debate at Pearl Harbor makes for interesting speculation. The Chinese had armies in the field, both on the nationalist side and the communist side, and some of those troops were very effective. By going into the Philippines, the Americans secured some native support, but the Philippines had been in reality an occupied country, whereas China, even on the coast of the China Seas, was never better than half occupied, and the Chinese were far more antipathetic as a whole to the Japanese than were the Filipinos, who numbered among their ranks many cooperators with the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Overall, the Central Pacific Campaign foreshadowed the future. It became apparent at Saipan, and even more so at Guam, that the Japanese would continue to resist ever more stoutly, if that was possible, as the Americans approached the inner core of the empire. American casualties would be heavier as they went along, and Japanese pockets of resistance would be harder to eradicate as the Japanese were given more territory in which to operate. All this became painfully apparent at Guam, so what was to happen at Okinawa, in particular, could have come as no surprise to those who knew. The primary sources for research for To the Marianas included the Operational Archive of the U.S. Navy Historical Section in the Washington Navy Yard. Key documents were the war diaries and action reports of the U.S. Fifth Fleet for Operation Forager, the Marianas invasion, and Operation Flintlock, the Marshall's invasion. Also utilized were the action reports of the U.S. Carrier Force in the Philippine Sea Battle, NRS 1977-17, which included the individual carriers and aviation commands aboard those carriers, and records of various carriers and squadrons from the winter and spring of 1943 to 44 and the summer of 1944. Additional sources included my own How They Won the War in the Pacific, Waybright and Talley, 1968, which provided insight into the command activities of the Central Pacific Forces, and To the Marianas, a sequel to Storm over the Gilberts, Van Nostrand Reinhold, 1978. Research materials from the first book were useful for the second, including Marine Corps records and naval records. Notable references include the U.S. Marine Corps' History of Marine Corps Operations in World War II, Volume 3, Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, Volumes 8, and Vice Admiral George C. Dyer's biography of Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. The Amphibians Came to Conquer, U.S. Government Printing Office, undated. Other important sources were Stanley Smith's The United States Marine Corps in World War II, Random House, 1969, and Battles of the Philippine Sea by Charles Lockwood and Hans Christian Adamson. Research for the Saipan and Tinian operations came from earlier work on The Men of the Gambler Bay, Erickson, 1979, covering an escort carrier's activities in these campaigns. Additional references include various volumes of History of United States Army Operations in World War II, particularly those dealing with the Gilberts and Marshall's operations, and some on logistics. Andrea Dalbas, Death of a Navy, Devin Adair, 1957, provided insight into Japanese activity during this period, as did Ito and Pinot's The End of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Norton, 1956, and Zenji Orita and Joseph Harrington's Why Boat Captain. Saburo Hayashi's Kogun, the story of the Japanese Army in the Pacific War, was useful, as were various reports from interrogations of Japanese officials and prisoners, including the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted in Japan at the end of the war, and reports by naval and marine intelligence sources. Interviews with figures such as Captain, later Rear Admiral, Charles J. Moore, Admiral Spruance's Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Harry W. Hill, who led amphibious forces in several operations, and Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was Admiral Mitcher's chief of staff, also contributed valuable material. Holland Smith's Coral and Brass, Scribner's 1949, details the Smith versus Smith quarrel, with additional information in Dyer's book about Turner. The Army history remained restrained on this matter. However, it was apparent that the 27th Division, as it was constituted, was not suited for battle, a problem remedied at Saipan, but only after Ralph Smith had been removed from command. How Ralph Smith came to be a commander in the Pacific remains an anomaly, as he was regarded in military circles in the 1940s as the leading American expert on the French Army. The tragedy of Smith versus Smith was inescapable. Ralph Smith was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, and Holland Smith had no recourse but to act, despite the predictable hornet's nest aroused in Washington.